Welcome to 2020 Philosophers, a series dedicated to the renewal of philosophical practices in the 21st century. Today, our guest is a mathematician and a philosopher. Pierre Cassou-Noguès is professor of philosophy at the University of Paris VIII, and he usually builds literary fictions as a method for exploring the possible and its limits. It means that Pierre is on both sides of science and literature, which allows him to combine philosophical speculation and the critique of our present time. His early research concerned the role of imagination, it means dreams and fiction, in the work of scientists such as Kurt Gödel and Norbert Wiener. And he has written, well, quite 17 books, considered among the most original of contemporary philosophy in French, including Une histoire de machines, de vampires et de fous in 2007, Mon zombie et moi in 2012, La Mélodie du tic-tac in 2013, Métaphysique du bord de mer in 2016, and the most recent connected to COVID-19, Virusland, a breathtaking exercise in philosophy that one reads like a novel. So you can ask Pierre Cassou-Noguès through the Q&A at the bottom of your screen some question, and I will read then your question after his talk. So Pierre, welcome to La Maison Française.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your introduction. I must correct it a little bit in the sense that when I was a student, I've studied mathematics as well as philosophy. I've been interested in logic and logicians, but I'm not a mathematician in the sense that I would have proven theorem. So I see myself more really as a philosopher and not really as a mathematician.
Okay.
But so I'm very happy to both honored and happy to discuss my research in this context. And so you told me that the topic of the seminar was really contemporary practice in philosophy. And so I decided to be really in the spirit of the time to entitle my lecture tonight, Philosophy in the Time of Virality. And so I will start with, so I will try and share my screen. You should see fiction philosophy in the time of virality. Okay, and so I will start with what I will call free news. So this is a quotation from Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, who is the head of the World Health Organization. And last spring, he said, fake news spreads faster and more easily than this virus, and is just as dangerous. So it may be true, but what is the what is the justification of this? Does he has a model, as you know, when you study different kind of disease or the spread of different viruses, you have usually model and number. Does he have models of number? Has he really compared the number of victims of the virus and the number of victims of fake news? Probably not. And so what I'm interested in here in this quotation is that it may be true, it may be useful to say that. He said it just after Donald Trump had invited people to eat disinfectant. So it may be useful to say this, but it is not actually science. It is not based on science as it should, since this is the head of the World Organization of the World Health Organization speaking. So it doesn't follow the style of discourse it should. In fact, it aims at being viral, just like a fake news. And it aims at spreading like a fake news. So it is a fake news that is true. And that's what I would call a true news. So my problem is the following. In fact, he's not exactly a doctor, a medical doctor, but he's speaking, let us say, as the voice of an organization of medical doctors. So, and apparently he can only speak, he can only be heard when, he can only be heard using some kind of virality. He cannot speak in as science should speak. So if that's the case, what about philosophy? Should philosophy remain outside of this network and of this virality? Can they remain outside? Should they? And is it not being locked down in an ivory tower, or as you see behind me, in some kind of library? So the problem for me is, or maybe even more acute, for some years now, as you've recalled, I've argued that philosophy should be based on fiction. And I've argued that it doesn't have to be true, at least not in the sense, at least not in the same sense as a newspaper, and probably not in the same sense as sociology. So to me, and that would be the bulk of my paper tonight. Well, that's tonight for me, but it's earlier here. Contemporary philosophy faces two challenges. The first one is to find a way out of the ivory tower of academia. And to me, philosophy is based on our experience, on life, if you want, not on life as we speak of living beings, by contrast to non-living, but on life as in the sense when we say that's life. And fiction is the way that established this relationship to experience. So, and that's what I will develop at length. So the first challenge is to find a way out of the ivory tower. And the ivory tower, which in a way is philosophy itself, and that I find a way for philosopher not to speak about philosophy, be it the history of philosophy, as we often do in continental philosophy, or be it problems that philosophers have recently raised, as it is sometimes the case in analytic philosophy. So find a way out of the ivory tower, but also that's the second challenge which the contemporary situation really faces us with, is finding a way out of what I call the through, like the through news. So I will develop several points. I'll share again my screen. So my first point is called philosophy as fiction, or philosophy by means of fiction. And that's what the scheme I develop in my book, Maison et moi. So first, philosophy to me is based on a sort of fiction. To be more precise, I should refer to Merleau-Ponty's expression, which he takes from Husserl, porter l'expérience à l'expression, to bring our experience to an expression. And my point is that this expression of our experience, this description, if you wish, doesn't have to be true in the sense of the weather forecast. That is, when I read the weather forecast, it says it rains. I look outside and I see if it rains or not. But that's not the way one reads philosophical texts. If you read Descartes' Metaphysical Meditation, Descartes tells us that he's writing wearing his kind of robe near the fire in his room, and there is a piece of wax on his desk. No one cares if it's true or not. He may be writing, outside or wherever. That's not the point of philosophy. One doesn't read philosophy in the same way as the weather forecast. So the philosophical text doesn't need to be true in this sense. And in fact, my point is one reads the philosophical text as a fiction. It just has this part, which is the description of our experience, just has to be convincing as a sort of fiction. The second point is that so to me, all philosophy uses this kind of fiction and can only repress it. So one way to repress it is to refer to the descriptions of other philosophers. Like one would say, and now, as I just said, and now remember Descartes' experience of the piece of wax in his metaphysical meditation. So I'm not myself trying to describe a piece of wax or anything. I'm just referring to the description that Descartes made of the piece of wax. But so in a way, this is a point about the history of philosophy, that all philosophy is based on the sort of description that can only be repressed. But conversely, and that's the point where that's a point that's more controversial. Philosophy should be able to take in all situation characters that appear in literature, even though these may be possible in real life, nor possible according to science. So my favorite example is the invisible man. So you can either refer to, I can either refer to Plato's Gyges in the Republic, or to H.G. Wells' character Griffin in the novel The Invisible Man. So everyone knows the story. The invisible man is called Griffin. He can see, but one cannot see him. Now, can we imagine an intangible man in the same sense? That is a character who could touch, but could not be touched. So what would happen when I shake hand with the intangible man? He would feel my hand in his hand, but I would not feel his hand into mine. It sounds bizarre. And in fact, there has not been in literature, in science fiction, an example of an intangible man which had the same aura as the invisible man. It seems that in literature, the intangible man is impossible. So to me, the existence in literature of an invisible man and the non-existence of an intangible man say something about vision and touch. It's not only something about our imagination, it is something about vision and touch, that vision and touch do not have the same property. So of course, ghosts who cannot touch are not a counterexample, because you cannot touch. If the ghosts can't touch you, you can't touch the ghost. So it's like the invisible man had become blind. But there is, in the post-phenomenological tradition, from Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, up to Derrida and Jean-Luc Nancy, there is a whole discussion about the reflexivity, as it is called, of sight, vision, or touch. Is it the same to when I touch, when I touch, says Merleau-Ponty, I am also touched. And is it the same as seeing and being seen? There's a whole discussion. And my point is that in this discussion, the invisible man should figure, because it says something about the property of sight, a property of sight that touch does not have. But of course, the invisible man is, there are no invisible men in real life. the invisible man may be an absurdity for science, nevertheless, it is important for the philosophical discussion. So the idea is that philosophy should be able to take into account the example of the invisible man, that is a character that appears in fiction, in literature, even though it is not possible in real life or possible according to science. So that's, in the end, that's a methodological postulate. You know, I can give argument to justify this postulate, but it can't be proven in any convincing sense. It is a postulate. So the idea is that fictions, when they work, that is, you know, you can read a book, doesn't interest you, you say, you know, what's the matter? It doesn't interest you, it doesn't work. Okay, so fiction, when it does work, like H.G. Wells novel, open up the possible, which is the domain of philosophy. So philosophy becomes a sort of imaginary variation that investigate the essential features of our experience through the prism of literary fiction. So some question one can ask in this perspective is, what are the essential properties of my body? That is, what properties of my body can I negate through fiction? And what property would I keep in any possible world, if you want? For example, as I said, it doesn't seem possible to become intangible as the invisible man is invisible. That is, being able to touch without being touched. But for instance, can we imagine that our bodies would be made of two parts? That is, I would have my head on the table that you see behind me, and the rest of my body would walk around. That I can write a fiction that would tell, I think, that would work and tell such a story. So it is a possible property. So the fact that our body are just one piece is, of course, what it's like in real life. It is maybe necessary according to science, but it's still a contingent property of our body. I can imagine different bodies. What kind of position can we imagine for the eye in the body? That kind of fiction, that kind of problem, one can make an imaginary variation in the sense of Husserl, but using literature or fiction in the sense of stories that are told, and investigate the possible contingent essential properties of our bodies, or the positions of the eye. So this method is related to Husserl. It is also related to Wittgenstein. To Wittgenstein, in Wittgenstein, in the philosophical investigation, Wittgenstein often tells stories in order to show how metaphysical problems could be raised in this situation that Wittgenstein is telling about, in absurd situation. And Wittgenstein's point is that metaphysical problems such as does the world exist, or to take the example of the book on certainty, is this hand my hand, or do machines think? Wittgenstein shows that these questions, they don't arise in normal life, in our everyday life. To give them sense, one must imagine a very strange situation, a situation that belongs to literature. And to Wittgenstein, it shows that these problems are nonsense. With the methodological postulate I've just enunciated, this story, they actually give meaning to this metaphysical problem. They actually shows that in fiction, these problems have a meaning, and once they have a meaning, you cannot close them any longer. These stories give meaning to the metaphysical problems. And so one can, in a way, go back to metaphysics, even when one acknowledges that these problems, such as does the world exist, can never be raised in our everyday life. Okay, and I have a third reference with Borges, but I'll skip it. So in the end, fiction is to the philosopher what the geometrical figure is to the geometer. It's a mode of intuition without which the philosopher's concepts are empty and turning idle. Okay, so then I'll distinguish two philosophical use of fiction. One of them would be speculative fictions. So it's this part is a discussion with Cassou, and after in his book After Finitude, Quentin Cassou sets an opposition between correlationism and speculation. And so according to, so I'll be really quick and a bit approximative. The correlationism is the idea that what exists only exists as the correlation of a certain act. Correlation. What exists only exists as correlate to a certain subjective act. It is only exists as correlate to myself. And then speculation, which opens the door to world in or times in which I would not be there. But the two correlation and the idea of Cassou is that there is, according to correlationism, which for him makes the core of contemporary philosophy, there is in the framework of correlationism, one cannot, for instance, speak of the world before humans, because if everything is correlated to me, if everything that exists only exists as correlated to my perception or my thinking, then I can never really go out of myself, and I can't really get to times when there were no human. But in a way, his argument is based on the principle of co-presence. That is, his idea is that the object that is correlated to me is necessary contemporary to myself, that these subjective acts, they only relate to elements that are contemporary or co-present. And one can find a counterexample in the history of philosophy, and memory in Bergson would be one. But I think fiction is also a counterexample to this idea. And an example is Lyotard's story in the article A Postmodern Fable, in which the story actually tells the story of the Earth and the development of humans. It mentioned the time when it was written. That's why it is postmodern in Lyotard's sense, and then the death of human and the continuation of the Earth after human. And so fiction, of course, fiction doesn't rely on this principle of co-presence. I can tell stories about universe in which I don't feature, at least I don't feature as a human. So if we accept that fiction is an intuition of the possible, then it opens up universes or times to which I do not belong. So the idea is that fiction can be speculation, really, or philosophy based on fiction can be speculation, that is telling about words to which I don't belong, in which I don't feature, even though it remains in the framework of correlationism. Okay. So speculative fiction and then critical fiction. So there would be two perspectives in this idea of critique. One of them is to put emphasis on the underlying fiction in the works of scientists. So that's a kind of work which I will not really speak about today, but we can, I'll be happy to come back to that in the discussion. I've worked on the archives of scientists, especially those of Kurt Gödel, the logician, and those of Norbert Wiener, the father of cybernetics. And my idea was to try and put into light fictions which had actually determined the direction of their work. So for Gödel and for Wiener, the fictions are different. For Gödel, Gödel had he had both some kind of, one could say that without putting too much emphasis on the world, but one could say he was mad. Like if I have an uncle that's a bit bizarre, I might say, you know, he's a bit mad. So Gödel was a bit mad in the same sense, and he had words idea, but he also developed what he called the systematic religion, which full of demons and angels. And one thing I was interested in was to see to what extent those bizarre ideas, those fiction, had actually influenced his work, his scientific work. In the case of Norbert Wiener, that's a bit different. Norbert Wiener actually wrote short stories, and so I've discussed these short stories and their influence on his cybernetics. But another perspective is to use the technological imaginary in order to try and invent new forms of experience, or as Wittgenstein would say, new forms of life, in which our experience or our representations of ourselves have different features. And that's also a way to put into question the meaning of these technologies. So I'll briefly speak about one example, which is Cogito Companion. So Cogito Companion is an app which you can buy on either the Google Store or the App Store. So now I should be able to show it to you. Okay, so it's an app, and what does this app does? It listens to your conversation when you use your phone. So, you know, when you have a conversation on the phone, the app listens to your conversation, and it doesn't, you know, it doesn't care, so to speak. It doesn't care about the words that you use. What it cares about is the intonation of your voice. And depending on the intonations of your voice, it gives you your mood. It tells you in what kind of mood you are. So unfortunately, there's this thing that wants me to translate the thing in French, but you can see, so yes, you can see. So here you can see the score of your mood depending on the day. So, you know, May 28th, so this is, you know, you're unhappy, you're happy. So May 28th, you weren't so happy. May 29, you are pretty happy. May 30 was less. The 31 was a good day. The 1st of June was a very bad day. So the app uses an algorithm to calculate your mood depending on the intonation of your voice. And it was devised by the company which is called Cogito. And it's and the Cogito actually made first an algorithm used by teleoperator. You know, when you know, my phone doesn't work, I call some kind of number and I have the hotline, and I have, you know, someone who is trying to repair with me my phone or my computer, and usually the customer is pretty angry about the whole thing. And so the operator will have Cogito, the algorithm, and the algorithm will study the intonation of the customer and the operator would calculate their mood and give advice to the operator, like show more empathy, be firm, speak more slowly, speak faster. And so it's the same algorithm that is used to calculate my mood on my phone. And of course, so it's interesting that the app is called Cogito, when the whole point of Derrida was to show how the cogito depended on the voice. But the point that is very interesting, that to me is very interesting, is, after all, why would we need such an app? So there are lots of different apps in the same of the same kind on the Apple Store or the Google Store. But why would you need such an app? Why would I want my telephone to show me my mood? And in our usual form of life, we are supposed to know our mood. That's just our form of life. And that's exactly the point that's the point on which Wittgenstein insisted. If, for instance, I come to the office and someone tells me, "Oh, Pierre, you don't look in a good mood today," and I say, "No, I'm in a good mood. I'm just a bit tired," and he might think that I'm lying, but if he acknowledged that I am in good faith, he would say, "Oh, I'm mistaken. He's in a good mood." And that's our form of life. I'm supposed to know my own mood. But what would happen if he would systematically think he's right and that I actually don't know my own mood? With a human, it seems an absurdity, but precisely with the telephone, with a machine, we seem to be able to accept it. And there are other examples using neuroscience, but there is the algorithm and using data analysis from our phone seems to be a more promising perspective, because it obviously the apparatus is less expensive, and it shows to me such app show to me that we may imagine another form of life where I would not know, the subject would not know what he is thinking or would not know his mood. And compared to our usual form of life, this is a kind of aberration. But that's precisely something that through technology we can imagine, and I think also point to what I think are some dangers of contemporary technologies. And that's also an example of how we can write about the actual world through fiction. Now, so yeah, I have a few minutes more. I'll again share the screen. So which medium? So in what I said previously, I meant fiction as literary fiction, stories that are told. They may be told orally, as in such a lecture, or they may be written, but they are more or less literature. So, but after all, why not, use films instead of text? I'm going through my work. So I've worked with two colleagues in film studies. I've worked on two films. One of them is Welcome to Erevan with Stéphane Desgoutin and Gwenno Lavagon, which you can see on the website. And another is Going On with Gwenno Lavagon. It's called Virusland. And the idea in this work was to try and do the same thing as I try to do in my books, using philosophy and fiction, trying to anchor philosophy in fiction, but doing the same thing using other kind of fiction, and fiction, filmic fiction, rather fictions in films, rather than fiction in text. So it implies that the philosopher should not only speak about films, but try and make films. Or why not an Instagram flow? So there was all these experiences were or are, because some are still going on, a way to try and extend the kind of fiction on which I'm working on as a philosopher. But then the question is, if you're trying to make video, if you're trying to work to do something on Instagram, can you not fall into the kind of virality that I was criticizing at the beginning? Are we not irresistibly attracted towards through? So that would be the last part. The last part of my lecture, philosophy and virality. So to what extent, and in a way, this part is really a series of questions on which I don't really have answered. In a way, the kind of the extent of the international virality that we've seen through the COVID and also the American elections have been difficult to accept for me as a philosopher who really argued that philosophy doesn't have much to do with truth, but is about fiction. So I will just go to two opposite points. So first, can philosophy remain outside of virality? So I'll take a kind of analogy with a story from Washington Irving. So Washington Irving described a man, he's in fact a politician, and you tell him a joke, and he says, "I don't understand." So you explain the joke to him, and then you say, "Well, it's not very funny, is it?" So the idea, of course, is that if it's legitimate not to understand the joke, but if you explain it at length, it's no longer funny. And one could say that after all, so the man is the governor of the state of New York in Washington Irving's story, but one could say that it may be a good portrait of the philosopher. Maybe the philosopher is the one who can always say, or to whom you can always say, "I don't understand." And the philosopher needs to explain more. But then the joke is no longer funny. The joke doesn't work. So one could say that there may be in philosophy this requirement that philosophy can always be explained more at length. But then, if you agree with that, then you cannot take part in the joke in a way, and you remain outside of this kind. You remain outside of the joke, and I don't think you can. I think philosophy precisely should be able to use something as the comical. And the other point I was going to make, if I find my text back, yes, it's I will share. It's a quotation from Ursula Le Guin, the science fiction writer. Where is it? Yes. So Le Guin distinguished fiction and invention. Fiction and lies, and it's a text from It's in the text from the book "Words Are My Matter," and here lies is really fake news. So Le Guin advocates the importance of fiction, but distinguish it from fake news. Fiction, she says, is invention, but it is not lies. It moves on a different level of reality from either fact-finding or lying. Don Quixote indulges his longing to be a knight till he loses touch with reality and makes an awful mess of his life. That's wishful thinking. Miguel Cervantes, by working out and telling the invented story of a man who wishes he were a knight, vastly increased our store of laughter and our human understanding. So the point is that for Le Guin, fake news or lies is not fiction in the sense that it actually aims at replacing a fact by another one. And fiction does not aim at replacing, at giving another fact. So the idea to distinguish philosophy as fiction and as a fiction which may use the networks and in a way be part with virality, the point to emphasis would be that philosophy is not news. And the problem is in its relation to truth. Philosophy, I argue, has no claim to truth, at least not to the truth of journalists, politicians, which would aim at truth, and sociologists. And philosophy must deliberately show its untruthness in this sense. Philosophy knows nothing. They are not scientists. They're not even sociologists. And it must be clear from the start. They should not mimic journalists or sociologists because they are not. And if they try to do that, they lose their footing. If they try and tell fact, it can only be through news and that are not so new. So then the problem is how to write about the actual world. How can the philosopher who knows nothing can say write about the virus? And the only possibility would be to try and rather be on the side of the novelist than the sociologist. Okay, thank you for your attention. I've been a bit long, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Pierre. That was great. And I put my app on and it says that you are in a good mood. Is it true or is it through news?
Actually, what I would want to do would be to make a lecture with the app on my phone and play it on the screen behind me in real time. And I wonder if the lecture would be better if I could keep an eye on my mood the whole time and try to maximize my mood score. Would it actually work? Would the lecture be better? And in what sense? Would it be more funny? Would the message go across better?
Okay, but we felt such an energy in your talk, and it's amazing. So you know that I really appreciate what you said about fiction and philosophy, and not only what you said, but your practice of fiction in philosophy. That's really great. And so I have a few questions, even if well, there are already some questions on your Q&A. Well, my first question is. You say that philosophy should experiment fictions, of course, but what is there a specificity of philosophical fiction, or could we say the same thing about any fiction? I mean, for example, would you say that Madame Bovary, Flaubert's novel, could be considered as a speculative fiction, or Diderot's work, Le Neveu de Rameau, or Le Rêve de d'Alembert, could be considered as philosophical fiction. So is there a specificity? Do you make well, a border between literary fiction and philosophical fiction? Do you mean that we need to see to understand an intention, a philosophical intention, to consider a text as a philosophical fiction?
I'm not saying that philosophy. So there are 2 points. I'm not saying that philosophy is only fiction. I'm saying that philosophy is based on fiction and starts as a fiction through this. Description is not exactly the word, but let's use it for because I don't have any better. But it starts with a fiction, but of course there must be something else. There must be some kind of conceptualization of this fiction. And in a way, when Merleau-Ponty says that the aim of philosophy is to bring experience to expression, he means that it's not only describing, it is describing in a sense that makes the experience more and more clear. So it is conceptualized. So I'm not saying it is only fiction, but it's based on fiction. Then, and this fiction is of the same kind as any literary fiction, as the work of the poet or some poet or the novelist. Now now I'm not saying that literature has the same aim to describe our experience in view of some conceptualization. Some literature has, like some science fiction, but I'm not saying that is the point of all literature. What I'm saying is simply that inside what is called literature, there is a part which is in fact part of philosophy. But this border isn't clear. Maybe if you're making some, if you're thinking about maybe, I don't know.
The question in the Q&A, there is an example. Albert Camus' The Plague fits the exact profile of what you talk about. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. Yes, I would. I must say also. So my point is that I don't want to give an intention. Of course, I don't want to give an intention to literature. I don't want to say literature is this. And obviously, there are plenty of different things that are called literature and which I would enjoy reading What I'm saying is simply that philosophy needs to be anchored in some kind of literature. And the border of this kind of literature, they may be fluctuant or maybe depend on what you're working on. Then to talk about Camus' La Peste, so in a way, this kind of work with fiction, some usually science fiction, I've been trying to do that for a long time. But one of the problems I had when writing my book on Virusland was how to write for a philosopher, how to write about the situation. In a sense, I'm not a doctor, a medical doctor. I'm not a sociologist, so I don't have immediate access to facts. I can only know, secondhand, and I'm not legitimate in making an argument against a medical doctor. So some, considering be it the lockdown, for instance, different medical doctors have different point of view. They have, the qualifications and they have arguments against each other. But I cannot enter into this debate because I'm not a medical doctor. So how could I write as a philosopher about, the lockdown or virality without pretending to have facts? How could, and at the same time, I do think that it is important for philosophers to write about the real world, but they should not pretend that they have facts, because they don't even have sociological facts. So what should how can the philosopher proceed in a way? And precisely, I think Camus has a way not to write about the plague exactly, but like something like solidarity in terms of crisis, or not the plague exactly, but and also I think Montesquieu in his Lettres persanes has a way to write about the real world without pretending to have facts. And yeah, but so that was for me, it was a new problem, different from the idea of fiction I had in philosophy.
Okay, Pierre, there are many questions, so
Okay.
I would like to ask you some more questions, but well, I want to first to read the question in the Q&A. There was a very early question before your talk, you know, so I read it. It's a long question by Christopher Williams. I think it's regarding the notion of imagination, what we call imagination in philosophy and also in literature. Because, well, yes, at the beginning of the 19th century, it was so important, imagination. So I read the question, putting aside science fiction, why do you think that so much recent literary fiction in France has moved towards an increased blending of the novel into the memoir genre? For example, Édouard Louis and his father, Annie Ernaux and her mother, Catherine Cusset and Camille Laurence and their love interests, Emmanuel Carrère and his family, Leila Semlani's Chanson douce, based on actual events in New York but transported to Paris. Why is the narrator so closely identified with the actual author rather than the traditional distance between writer and characters in books? Is it because nowadays we are besieged by the media with images and real events, or individual obsession with Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and social media? Is it a widespread erosion of readers' inner life that makes them more interested in the telling of true stories transposed to fiction? Or is the author's lack of imagination? Well, that's a long question. So could you say something about the role of fiction and imagination in, well, if we have to make the difference between imagination and fiction? Because of course, autofiction is a fiction, but would you have something to say about this notion of fiction in literature and especially in contemporary literature?
No, it's in a way you could say that probably the most important text in for modern philosophy is an autofiction. Descartes is in his metaphysical meditation starts with telling about himself, or that's even worse in the discourse of the method. He starts about telling about himself, about his life, about his travel, and he's looking for certainty. And then it gets somewhere else. So that's and I think it's and there are also lots of Descartes letters which really tell about himself in a really fascinating way, and in some letter Descartes is really a fascinating writer, just as some kind of novelist. So in a way, I think the philosophical fiction has an ambiguous relation to the autofiction, in the sense that especially has an ambiguous relation to the autofiction. And I think Descartes has set for us a model which starts with our first-hand experience and goes somewhere else. And then the important thing is to go somewhere else. So the philosophical fiction, to me, really has an ambiguous relationship to the autofiction. Then again, I'm very careful about not speaking about literature in general. What I'm interested in is a short portion, a small portion of literature, which is to me like really the drawing for the geometer, something on which philosophy is based. So I of course, that's not true, but I would even want to say that I'm not interested in literature. Yeah, and of course, that's not true, but
yeah, in this Virusland, your recent book, who talks? Is it you? What's the status of this ego who says I in this book?
That's the point. It's a character, and I would agree. I would argue that Descartes, in his metaphysical meditation, is a character, and we don't care whether it is true or not. And in the same sense, so yeah, in the same sense, I do want to insist on the fact that what I say in a book which is, which has the mentioned philosophy on it may not be true. Of course, that when I say that I'm so the book tells about the first lockdown where I'm stuck in a small seaside resort. I may have written everything in Paris, and everything may be false, and to me, it would not undermine whatever philosophical value the book may have.
Of course.
Then, of course, I try to make and of course, I try to make the character as credible, as convincing as possible, so it may look like me as well.
Okay. So next question: isn't theology also based on fictional worlds, and does it differ from the philosophical correlation with literature? This question from Marina Hall.
So again, when I use fiction, I don't use fiction as like imagination, and especially in the Husserlian sense, imagination in one's head. What I first mean is stories. That is, you tell stories, and you tell a story either in writing or talking to someone, and that's where you see whether the story works or not, and whether you can. So again, because my subject is not literature, I don't investigate what it means that a story works, or how does it work, or why does it work. I just take it for granted that if you read the story, sometimes you say, well, it's really interesting, and you want to know more about the character, even though as the Invisible Man, they are not impossible in real life. They may be even an absurdity for science. You interested, or there may be a pure contradiction, like you may have stories about a square triangle, and you would be interested in it. And so there are stories that work and stories that don't work. But the imagination is a story. And then, in a second sense, the story, after all, may also be a film or an art installation, and there are art installations which tell a story not without language, but a story in which language has only a small part, but it's nevertheless some kind of story. So about theology, and I was in a way faced with this kind of question when I was working on Gödel, because Gödel, Norbert Wiener actually wrote short stories, so he fitted perfectly in my framework, but that was not the case of the logician Kurt Gödel. Kurt Gödel was really trying to make what he called a theology. So to what extent could I consider this theology to be a fiction, to be a story? It would imply, for instance, that, theological text, or if this is the Christian theology, the Bible, would be literature, would be just, a fiction. And Gödel was working on some kind of Christian theology. So my way out for Gödel was that even though Gödel did mean to do theology, the thing he was interested in were in fact very much related to the science fiction of his time, and well, to science fiction. Like he was very interested in the idea of angels and demons, but what he was interested in was in fact some rational mind which would not be human. But one example of rational mind which are not human in the science fiction of the 50s are, of course, extraterrestrial aliens. And in fact, there is, for instance, there's a novel by Kurt Vonnegut where there are aliens who don't think, alien who don't live in time, and they're very close to Gödel's angels. And actually, Gödel writes a note about these aliens in the novel of Kurt Vonnegut. So, yeah, my way out of this question, which is an interesting question, was to make a relationship between the kind of theological question that interested Gödel and the science fiction of his time.
Okay, thank you, Pierre. Next question from George Morose about the relationship between the connection between fiction and the search for truth. The pre-Socratic Greeks with their fantastic claims and Plato with his myth seems to have aimed at truth. They have used fiction at the service of truth. Would you agree with that?
Yes, of course, I would agree with that. But in my work, there is also, in a way, there's a practical aspect. And I like to write fiction, and I like to write philosophy and fiction. And I want to have a framework that makes it easy and legitimate. So that's why I'm very careful to distinguish the question of truth in philosophy or the meaning of truth in philosophy to that of the for truth in philosophy and truth as the truth of the weather forecast, or even truth of as truth for sociology. If you read sociology, you expect what is said to be true in the real world. My point is that it's not the philosophy don't deal with such fact. Then can you find another way in which one may use the term truth in philosophy? Of course, I can't say that philosophy doesn't have anything to do with truth. So what would be, so if truth in philosophy is not the truth of the weather forecast, what would be the meaning of truth in philosophy? In a way, of course, that's an interesting question. There's no doubt about it. But in a way, I'm more interested in trying to work out philosophical fictions and trying to investigate domains that the philosophical tradition have somehow ignored. Then I'm more interested in that than in working out philosophical notions such as truth. For instance, for an example of a philosophical domain that the philosophical tradition have ignored or repressed, there's the seaside. And it's extraordinary how much philosophy, even in the 20th century, is related to the idea of Earth, and especially in the post-phenomenological tradition. And basically, lots of philosophers were spending their holidays on the seaside, as everyone. But there's very, very little philosophy about the seaside. Even Merleau-Ponty, who is like a magnificent writer, and he writes about sleep in like breathtaking pages. In his last book, he's in Provence, and he writes about water, but the only water he can write about is in L'Œil et l'Esprit, is the water of his swimming pool. It seems that there is something in the sea that is on the seaside, and the sea that is really difficult for philosopher. And on the contrary, of course, there is lots of literature about the seaside and the sea. So, you know, how can one try and use fiction in order to incorporate the sea in philosophy? And in a way, I'm more interested in working this in, you know, writing and this fiction, or studying this fiction, than in working out the really classical notions such as that of truth, which yeah.
Okay. Following question from the same person. Leibniz monadology is in some way a piece of science fiction, and more generally, as pointed out by Deleuze, puts forward a quasi-delusional system. This is close to your views, except that you seem to renounce to the ambitions of Leibniz for philosophy.
Well, I renounce a lot. I renounce to many of Leibniz ambition. You know, that's the fact with philosophers nowadays. They don't have the same ambitions. No, I mean, I would agree with everything in the question, that the monadology, or also the last chapter of the Théodicée. I'm not sure how you say it in English. Theodicéus, maybe, where the character is brought into a bizarre building when he sees all possible world, and they are very close to science fiction, and of course Deleuze is one of the rare philosophers which has been interested in that relationship. And then, yes, it's true that I renounced to many of Leibniz's ambitions, yes, but also yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, of course, there are also ambitions, you know, some of Leibniz's ambition that are, yeah, I mean, there are some of Leibniz's ambition may no longer be tenable, in particular the relationship between experience and mathematics and things like that.
Okay. So perhaps last question, and I will have just a final question for you from an attendee. What do you think of the trickle-down theory of reality from physics to philosophy to fiction and non-fiction, with each discipline branching from its antecedents?
Well, I don't think it. So the trickle-down theory of reality would be that physics invents something, it goes to philosophy and then to fiction. I don't think it's true at all. A good example to me is the time travel. The time travel really became a subject of discussion from H.G. Wells, The Time Machine, and from there, with Gödel, it goes into physics, and then from physics it goes into philosophy. So I would agree that philosophy would be would come after, as the famous expression says, but between physics and fiction, I mean, of course, there may be a physical notion that end up as fiction, but there may also be fiction situation that actually help building up physics.
Okay, Pierre, last question about, I would like you to go back to Virusland, your recent book, and to say something more concrete about it. What's your purpose in this book? Because that's, of course, very well connected to,
yeah, well, the purpose is, so it's the purpose, at the very, so it was written in April and May last year during the lockdown in France, the end of the lockdown in France. And the beginning of I started writing the book in the few days after I tried to start writing the book in the few days after the beginning of the lockdown, and I was looking at the news on TV, and there was this swimmer, and so the journalist was on with the Sea Brigade in Marseille, the police of the sea in Marseille, and they were on a boat, and they caught a swimmer. He must have been a real champion because he was really far from the beach. Like the houses were really far, and he was like in a wetsuit, and they put him, they brought him up on the boat, and they gave him a fine because the beach were forbidden. And but of course it had only, maybe it was justified, but it had only a very mediate relationship to the transmission of the virus, because the swimmer was like maybe a mile away from the coast. He had no chance of either giving or catching the virus. But he looked at the journalist and at the camera, and he said, well, yes, I knew I was doing something that was not good. And what was this thing that was not good that he was doing? And how come how did he came to think that he was doing something that was not good, when this thing had no close relationship to maybe it had a relationship. I'm not saying that it doesn't have a relationship, but it has no immediate relationship to the transmission of the virus. So to me, there was something very bizarre about the whole situation, And the purpose of the book is really to try and understand what was happening in this scene. And of course, again, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not a sociologist, so in no way I want to argue that the measures that were taken were not the right one. Maybe it was good to forbid swimmer to swim. He obviously was a swimmer champion, but maybe it was a good thing to forbid him to go and swim far from the beach. But there is something strange in it, and I want to describe it and try and understand what's happening. First, describing something that compared to our usual form of life is strange, weird, maybe absurd, and try and understand where does it come from and what does it mean, but without raising the question of whether it is justified, because to do that, you would need to be both a medical doctor and a sociologist, and probably no one is.
Okay. I have to say that, well, by reading your book, it seems like the narrator is quite paranoid. There is a kind of paranoia in this book. Would you agree with that?
I'm not sure I understand.
The fact that, there are dangers anywhere coming from outside, and you feel completely, well, this guilt, this constantly, well, the character feels guilty and even reacting to this atmosphere. You have something to say about the unfair lockdown, or justified?
No, it's interesting. I had not realized the character could be paranoid. I'm not too sure about paranoid. I mean, of course, and I think that was an experience that lots of us shared. A kind of mixed between fear and at the beginning I was definitely afraid, an experience between fear and or maybe an anxiety also that did not only come from the fear of being sick, but also from something which I think is akin to Freud's Unheimlichkeit, the uncanny. The fact that there was something uncanny in the atmosphere in France at the beginning of the lockdown, and I think it really comes from the fact that it looks so much like fiction which we had already seen, and that's in Freud text. That's one of the way in which the uncanny comes. That when you think, that's not possible, I'm in a fiction, there's something wrong. And I think there was the fear of the virus, but also this anxiety. In France, people could have fine when they went out. We were allowed to do we are still allowed to do 1 kilometer around our. We need a special at least we need a special justification to walk more than 1 kilometer from our home. So and you can have a fine. Rather, after 2 times, it's a rather expensive fine. So that might make the character of the book a bit paranoiac, because he has much trouble not getting further from his house, and of course, yes, then one may be worried about a certain feature of surveillance that are set up not in France, but for instance in China, with there's at one point last spring at least, there was a QR code, code on the phone, a good health code that that was calculated with parameters that the citizen did not know, and that you flash your phone on the kind of reader, which would open the door or not, and it worked for like parks, malls, trains, and that's a kind of surveillance in China, which is in China, not in France or in the US, but which is nevertheless, I think, worrying. So that might add for some paranoia.
Okay, so very last question, Pierre. I'm coming back to the sense of philosophy. In your book, in your recent book, you referred to Norbert Wiener about the circulation of the cliché circulating through its repetition. And you said that's always the risk for even a philosophical message to become viral. So could you say, you already said something about this risk, but could you say, well, for you, if there is a way to escape this danger, to avoid for philosophical message to become viral?
Yeah, Norbert Wiener is probably with Gabriel Tarn, one of the first to discuss this idea of let us say a uniformization that is not polarized. That is, in Freud or Stigler or most analysis of identification or uniformization, there is one pole that irradiates to a multitude of receptors. And how can one? But of course, that's not what happens through networks. We don't watch so much TV. We are more and more on the internet, and how does this kind of uniformization comes in networks? And Wiener has a discussion about how is a message? Why do some message? You send a message, say on Twitter. Some of them get repeated, millions of times, and others stops. How could you describe a message that is retweeted and one that stops? What makes the difference between them? And Wiener has this idea of simplicity. He has also, but at least he, and of course, it's not only simplicity that makes a message viral and another one not viral, but at least he's one of the first to really isolate this question: what makes a message viral? And in the book, I compare this idea of viral message to Freud theory of the I forgot the weeds, yeah, I forgot the singer's name is in English. That just gets out of my mind. But so yeah, that's and so the danger for philosophy or philosopher is not so much to get viral, but to I mean, the example I told at the very beginning, the president of the World Health Organization, it seems that he can only be heard by making a statement that is viral. And that's not the way obviously the statement is exaggerated, and or at least it is unjustified as such. And because no one knows, no one has compared the number of victims from the virus and the number of victims from fake news. But it seems he can only be heard by making this claim that is meant to be viral. And it seems there's a kind of difficulty for philosophy that either you would be completely unheard, you would be able, you would be in your ivory tower, or if you want to be heard, don't you have to make those kind of statements? And then are you not losing, something about philosophy, which maybe not exactly in an argumentation, but still. So, and in a way, I've tried to make, to relate philosophy to fiction, to try work with colleagues in art on films. Of course, you can only make a film if you have money, and you need more money than to write a book, and you only get money if the short pieces that you show about the film, if they kind of work on networks. And are you not attracted to this kind of variety, where in a way you would lose the philosophy, just as when the president of the World Health Organization says something like that, even though it may be justified, it may be useful, he's losing something about medicine. Because if you're speaking as a medical doctor or as the president of organization of medical doctor, you can't, to me, you can't say something which is not based on medical evidence.
Okay, Pierre, thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Okay, bye.
Bye.